The river was running fast and brown and mean, swollen with 3 days of hard mountain rain, and Matilda Underwood stood at its edge with her boots already soaked through, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had come this far. She had crossed half of Texas on a borrowed mule, had buried her last dollar in the dirt outside of Laredo, had outrun a man she never wanted to see again, and she was not going to let a swollen river be the thing that finally broke her. She hitched her skirts up past her knees and took one step into the current, and the cold of it hit her like a slap, like betrayal, like every terrible thing she had tried to leave behind. That was when she heard him. The voice came from the opposite bank, low and certain and carrying clean over the noise of the rushing water, and it stopped her cold in a way that the current itself had not quite managed to do. "I'm not letting you cross alone." She looked up. He was standing there on the far side of the river, broad-shouldered against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, his hat pushed back on his dark head, his boots planted wide in the red Texas dirt. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately name, something that was not pity and was not amusement, and was not the kind of hungry appraisal she had learned to be wary of from men in this part of the world. He was simply watching her, as if he had been standing there for a while and intended to keep standing there until she made a sensible decision. Matilda Underwood had not made a sensible decision in the better part of 2 months. She was not entirely sure she remembered how. She stood there in the current with the water pulling at her ankles, and she stared at the man on the opposite bank, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something she had packed away very carefully in a box she had no intention of opening, and she thought, with a kind of desperate clarity, that she was in considerably more trouble than she had realized. But to understand how she had come to be standing in a swollen river in the hill country of Texas in the autumn of 1878, staring at a stranger who was looking at her like she was something worth keeping, you have to go back to the beginning of it. You have to go back to the letter. The letter had arrived at the boarding house in San Antonio on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by a boy who could not have been older than 12, and who seemed enormously pleased with himself for having tracked her down. Matilda had been living at Mrs. Greer's establishment for 6 weeks by that point, working in the kitchen in exchange for room and board, and she had almost grown comfortable there, which was how she knew it was time to move on. Matilda had a talent for almost growing comfortable and then having something come along to destroy it. She had decided, after the 3rd time it happened, to stop being surprised by it. The letter was from a lawyer in a town called Cutter's Creek, a day and a half's ride north and east of San Antonio, in the hill country where the cedar and live oak grew thick along the limestone ridges. The lawyer's name was Mr. Horace Bell, and he wrote in a cramped but precise hand that Matilda's great uncle, a man named Edmund Underwood, had died in August and had left his 40-acre property to his only surviving relative, which the letter indicated was Matilda herself. She had sat in the kitchen of Mrs. Greer's boarding house and read the letter 3 times. She had never met her great-uncle Edmund. She had not known he existed. Her father had not spoken of his family with any fondness, or indeed with any specificity at all, and after her father died and her mother followed him 2 years later, Matilda had been left with a name, a small trunk of clothes, and absolutely nothing else to show for 23 years of living. The 40 acres meant a roof. It meant walls. It meant something that was hers, truly and legally hers, which was a concept so foreign to Matilda's recent experience that she had to read the letter a 4th time before she believed it. She gave notice to Mrs. Greer that same afternoon. The trouble began 3 days later, when a man named Gerald Phipps appeared at the boarding house and asked for her by name. Matilda had made the mistake of mentioning the inheritance to a girl named Clara who worked alongside her in the kitchen, and Clara, who had no particular malice but an extraordinary inability to keep a secret, had apparently mentioned it to someone who had mentioned it to Gerald Phipps, who was, as it turned out, a man with a very specific and very dark interest in newly inherited properties in the hill country. Gerald Phipps was tall and well-dressed, and smelled of bay rum and something underneath the bay rum that Matilda could not name but instinctively distrusted. He smiled at her with all his teeth and told her that he represented certain business interests that had been looking to acquire land in the Cutter's Creek area, and that he would be very interested in discussing a purchase. Matilda told him the property was not for sale. Gerald Phipps smiled wider and said that everything had a price. Matilda said that some things did not, and she closed the door. That should have been the end of it, except that Gerald Phipps had a hidden motive that went considerably deeper than simple land acquisition. The hill country around Cutter's Creek sat above an aquifer, and whoever controlled the water rights controlled the ranchers who depended on that water, and there were men in San Antonio and Austin who wanted that control very badly and were willing to pay extremely well for it. Edmund Underwood's 40 acres sat at the precise center of the most productive section of that aquifer. It was, in other words, worth considerably more than 40 acres of cedar scrub had any right to be. Matilda did not know any of this yet. She only knew that Gerald Phipps frightened her, and that her instincts, which had been honed by 2 years of surviving alone in a world that was not particularly kind to young women without resources, were telling her to move quickly and quietly, and not to let anyone know exactly when she was leaving or which road she was taking. She left before dawn on a Thursday, on a mule she had borrowed from Mrs. Greer's neighbor with a promise to return it or send payment, with everything she owned in the leather saddlebag across the mule's back. She took the back roads north and kept to the cedar breaks where the ridges hid her from the main track, and for 2 days she made reasonable progress, and she allowed herself to think that she had been clever enough and fast enough to leave Gerald Phipps and his hidden motives behind her. On the 3rd day it rained. It rained in the way that the Texas hill country sometimes rained in October, which was to say as if the sky had decided to conduct a personal grudge against the earth below it. The roads turned to red mud, and the creeks came up, and the mule, which had been patient and reliable up to that point, developed a strong and apparently non-negotiable opinion about walking through moving water. By the time Matilda reached the Blanco River crossing at late afternoon on the 3rd day, she was soaked to the skin. The mule had refused to go another step, and the river, which she had been told was normally easy enough to ford at this time of year, was running 3 feet above its banks and carrying with it a significant quantity of cedar branches, mud, and what appeared to be someone's chicken coop. She had tied the mule to a hackberry tree and stood at the river's edge and tried to calculate whether she could cross on foot, and she had been standing there doing that calculation for approximately 3 minutes when the voice came from the opposite bank, and everything changed. "I am not letting you cross alone." David Walker had been riding the fence line on the eastern edge of his property when the rain started coming down with serious intent, and he had been heading back toward the river crossing to get home when he saw the woman. She was standing at the water's edge on the south bank, her dark hair plastered flat against her head by the rain, her skirts muddy to the knee, and she had 1 foot already in the current with an expression on her face that he recognized as the particular stubbornness of someone who had already decided they were going to do something inadvisable and was merely working up the nerve to follow through on it. He had seen that expression before. He had worn that expression before. He recognized it as the face a person made when they had run out of other options, and something about it made his chest feel strange in a way that he did not immediately examine. He shouted his refusal across the water and she looked up at him, and even at that distance, and through the curtain of rain he could see that she was not frightened by him, exactly, but that she was assessing him the way a woman who had learned to be careful assessed a stranger, which was with complete and unsentimental clarity. He was 31 years old, David Walker, and he had owned the Walker Ranch for 4 years, having inherited it from his father in somewhat complicated circumstances that still occasionally kept him awake at night. He was 6 feet and an inch of dark hair and steady hands, and a jaw that his mother had once described as unnecessarily stubborn. And he was not accustomed to having women stare at him with that particular quality of cool-headed evaluation. Most women in Cutter's Creek either knew him well enough to be comfortable or were new to the area, and simply saw the ranch and decided he was a fine prospect. Neither of those things applied to the woman on the south bank of the Blanco River, who was looking at him as if she was trying to determine whether he was a threat or an inconvenience. He supposed, from her perspective, those might not be entirely separate categories. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called across the water. "The current is too strong. You will not make it on foot. I have a rope." She stood there for a moment that seemed much longer than it actually was, with the river pulling at her ankle and the rain coming down around her, and then she stepped back onto the bank and crossed her arms over her chest and called back, "Who are you?" He could have laughed at that. He respected it instead. "David Walker. I own the ranch on this side of the river." "Who are you?" A pause. "Matilda Underwood. I am trying to get to Cutter's Creek." Something happened in David Walker's chest when he heard that name. Not the large, dramatic thing that he could not have explained to anyone, but a smaller, quieter thing, the kind of recognition that precedes understanding. He had heard that name. Just 2 days ago, in Horace Bell's office, where he had gone to sort out a property dispute with his neighbor to the south, the lawyer had been speaking with his clerk about a letter he had sent to a woman named Underwood regarding old Edmund's land. Old Edmund Underwood had been David's neighbor to the north. Had been because the old man was dead now, and his land was unclaimed, and there were people in the county and beyond it who were watching that land the way hawks watched an open field. David Walker knew more about the situation than the woman on the south bank could possibly imagine, and what he knew made him want to get her across this river and onto safe ground as quickly as was humanly possible. He uncoiled the rope from his saddle horn and tied one end around the solid trunk of a post oak that stood close to the water, and he weighted the other end with a loop that he could throw. He was a good thrower. He had grown up on this land and roped things since he could walk, and the rope sailed clean across the flooded river and landed at Matilda Underwood's feet with 10 inches to spare. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him, then picked it up and tied it around her waist with a knot that told him immediately that she was not unfamiliar with practical work. He held the other end of the rope and waded into the current himself, which was cold and strong enough to make his horse shift nervously on the bank, and he went across that river to meet her, because he had said he was not letting her cross alone, and David Walker did not say things he did not mean. The crossing was hard. The water came up past his waist at the deepest point, and the current shoved at him with a kind of mindless, impersonal violence. And when he reached her side, she had both hands on the rope and her jaw set with that same determined stubbornness he had noticed from the far bank. He took the rope between them and shortened it so that there were only 3 feet between them, and he told her to hold onto his arm, and she did, her fingers cold and strong through the wet sleeve of his shirt, and they went into the river together. There was a moment, about 2/3 of the way across, when the current surged with a sudden spike of force, and she stumbled and went under for half a second, and his arm came around her waist before he had consciously decided to move it, and he hauled her up against his side and kept moving because stopping was more dangerous than anything else they could do. She came up gasping and got her feet under her and pressed her free hand flat against his chest to steady herself, and they looked at each other for 1 second in the middle of that brown rushing water, faces 6 inches apart, both of them breathing hard, and something passed between them that was considerably more significant than gratitude. They reached the north bank and climbed out onto the red mud and stood there dripping and catching their breath, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Matilda Underwood wrung out a section of her skirt with both hands, very businesslike, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Walker." "David," he said, before he could think better of it. She looked at him with that clear, measuring gaze. "David," she said. And then, as if testing the word, she said it again more quietly, and he felt it somewhere around his sternum like a small, warm fire. Her mule, it turned out, was not going to cross the river under any circumstances. David spent 20 minutes trying various approaches to the problem, and eventually concluded that the animal had made a final and irrevocable decision on the matter. He left it tied in the shelter of the hackberry grove with enough slack to graze, and told Matilda he would send someone back for it when the water went down, which it would, probably by tomorrow morning. She had retrieved her saddlebag from the mule's back before they crossed, so she had her belongings, such as they were, and he helped her onto his horse behind him, and they rode the 3 miles to the Walker Ranch in the rain. The ranch house was a solid, well-made structure of limestone and cedar, built by David's father in 1859 and added to twice since then. It sat on a rise above the river with a clear view in 3 directions, and a kitchen garden to the south, and a smokehouse, and a bunkhouse, and 2 large barns arranged around a central yard, and the whole place had the look of a working ranch that was managed by someone who paid attention. There were 2 hired men in the bunkhouse, brothers named Pete and Sam Cordero, and a woman named Rosa Cordero who was Pete's wife and who kept the house and cooked for the whole operation. It was Rosa who came out onto the porch when David rode up with a soaking wet stranger behind him, and Rosa who took one look at Matilda Underwood and immediately took charge in the way that Rosa Cordero took charge of all situations that required competence and warmth, which was to say completely, and without any unnecessary conversation. She had Matilda into the house and out of her wet things, and wrapped in a dry blanket with a cup of coffee in her hands within 15 minutes, and she fed her a plate of beans and cornbread and salt pork, and watched her eat with the focused attention of someone who had learned to assess need accurately. And when Matilda had eaten and drunk 2 cups of coffee, and the color had come back into her face, Rosa told David that their guest would be sleeping in the spare room and that he could ask his questions in the morning. David, who respected Rosa enormously and also recognized when he was being managed, agreed to this. He lay awake that night for a long time listening to the rain on the limestone roof and thinking about the things he knew and the things Matilda Underwood did not yet know and what the overlap between those 2 things was going to mean for both of them. He thought about her hand on his chest in the middle of the river. He thought about the way she had said his name, quietly, as if she was deciding whether to trust it. He was not a man who made a practice of rapid attachment. He had been careful with himself in that regard, particularly since the business with his father, which had left him with a complicated inheritance in more ways than one. The ranch was his, and he was proud of it, and he worked it hard, and he had built something real here. But there was a darkness at the edge of it that he had never fully resolved, a set of choices his father had made in the last years of his life that had left David with certain obligations and certain enemies, and a wariness about trust that he had not yet entirely overcome. He would tell her in the morning, he decided. He would tell her about Gerald Phipps, and about the water rights, and about why her inheritance was more complicated and more dangerous than a lawyer's letter had led her to expect. He would tell her everything he knew, because she deserved to know it, and because if he was going to help her he needed her to have the full picture, and because he had carried too many secrets already and he was tired of the weight of them. Morning came pale and clear, the rain entirely spent, the sky washed to a clean pale blue that made the cedar hills look freshly made. Matilda was already in the kitchen when David came down, sitting across the table from Rosa with a cup of coffee, and a piece of paper covered in figures that she was apparently explaining to Rosa with great seriousness. Rosa was listening with her chin in her hand, and her dark eyes sharp and interested. They both looked up when David came in. "She is trying to work out how much fencing the north quarter of Edmund Underwood's property needs," Rosa told him, by way of greeting. David looked at the figures on the paper and then looked at Matilda, who looked back at him steadily. She was dry now, her dark hair braided over one shoulder, wearing what appeared to be her best dress, which was a plain dark blue wool that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. She looked like a woman who had been through something significant and had decided, with great intention, not to let it show more than necessary. "How much do you know about your inheritance?" he asked, sitting down and accepting the coffee Rosa put in front of him. "I know it is 40 acres of hill country in the Cutters Creek area and that it belonged to a great uncle I never met," Matilda said. "I know it has a house on it, or at least there was a house on it when Mr. Bell wrote the letter. I know it is mine." "It is yours," David confirmed. "And I need to tell you some things about it that you do not yet know." He told her about the aquifer. He told her about the water rights, and about the way the land distribution in the area meant that whoever controlled the Underwood parcel effectively controlled the water table for 4 surrounding ranches, including his own. He told her about the consortium of businessmen in San Antonio who wanted those water rights, and what they intended to do with them, which was to charge the ranchers for access to water that their families had been using freely for 2 decades, or alternatively to force those ranchers to sell at depressed prices and take the land themselves. He told her about Gerald Phipps, who was the face of that consortium in the hill country, and about how Phipps operated, which was primarily through a combination of legal pressure, deliberate intimidation, and the occasional use of men who were hired specifically to create situations that required resolution. Matilda listened to all of this with great stillness, her coffee cup held in both hands, her eyes on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "This is why Phipps came to see me in San Antonio," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes. And when I refused to sell, he would have known I was coming here. He would have known before I left San Antonio. Probably." She set her coffee cup down with a careful, deliberate motion. "The road washout, the 3 days of rain," she paused. "How long do you think I have before someone arrives in Cutters Creek looking for me?" David had been thinking about this since approximately midnight. "Not long. Phipps moves quickly when he thinks a situation requires it. He will try the legal approach first, which means pressuring Horace Bell to raise complications about the inheritance. He will argue that Edmund Underwood was not mentally sound when he made his will, or that there is a competing claim, or both." "Is there a competing claim?" "No. Edmund was perfectly sound when he made his will, and there are witnesses I know personally who will say so. But Phipps does not need the legal approach to succeed. He only needs it to create delay and uncertainty and expense, and then he will follow up with the other kind of pressure." Matilda was quiet again, and then she said, "What do you get out of helping me?" The directness of it surprised him, and he looked at her for a moment before answering, and he decided that she deserved the same directness back. "My ranch depends on the aquifer. If Phipps controls the water rights on your land, he controls my water. I have a practical interest in you being established as the legal owner and in you choosing to be a good neighbor." She held his gaze. "And the fact that you came into a flooding river to make sure I crossed safely, was that practical interest too?" The question was out there between them, plain and clear as the morning sky, and David Walker, who was not a man who lied to himself about things, said, "No, that was something else." Rosa, who had been very quietly and very deliberately washing dishes at the other end of the kitchen, found a reason to go outside at approximately that moment. The color that came into Matilda's cheeks was the most honest thing he had seen in a long time, and she looked down at her coffee cup and then back at him, and there was something in her eyes that was warm and startled and carefully guarded all at once, and he thought that she had been protecting herself for a considerable time, and that the protection had become habitual in the way that defenses did when they had been necessary long enough. "I think we should ride to Cutters Creek today," she said, which was not an answer and was also entirely an answer, and David said yes, they should, and that he would ride with her. They rode out together at 9 in the morning, David on his bay gelding and Matilda on a chestnut mare that David saddled for her, and the hill country was washed clean by the rain, and the light came through the cedar in long golden bars, and the air smelled of wet limestone and juniper. and the particular sharp sweetness of Texas in October after rain. They rode side by side on the track north, and the conversation moved easily between practical things, which were the state of the roads and the best way to approach Horace Bell, and what needed to be done first to establish Matilda's claim, and the other things that moved underneath the practical things and did not yet have words but were present and unmistakable. He learned things about her on that ride. He learned that she had grown up in Louisiana, in a small town on the Mississippi, and that her father had been a schoolteacher of some distinction, and her mother a woman of considerable intelligence and very little luck, and that when they both died within 2 years of each other, she had been left with nothing, and had spent the subsequent 2 years moving west and working, doing what work was available to a young woman of education and limited capital in the 1870s, which was mostly cooking and sewing and occasional teaching, none of it permanent, and none of it leading to anything resembling security. He learned that she had once taught school for a winter in a small settlement in central Texas, and had loved it with a fierce and particular love that she spoke about with a carefulness that suggested she had learned not to love things she could not keep. He learned that she read everything she could get her hands on, which in the places she had been was not nearly enough, and that she had strong and specific opinions about the use of the Oxford comma, which made him laugh, which seemed to surprise her, as if she had not expected him to understand the reference. He told her things, too, because it seemed only fair, and because there was something about the way she listened, with her whole attention, that made him want to be told as well as to tell. He told her about growing up on the Walker Ranch, and about his father, who had been a hard man in some ways and a good man in others, and who had made a set of decisions in the last 2 years of his life that David had been slowly and painstakingly undoing ever since. He told her about the deals his father had made with the San Antonio business interests, which had started in good faith and ended in something considerably murkier, and about how David had spent 4 years trying to extricate the ranch from obligations his father had created without fully understanding their implications. He did not tell her all of it. There were parts of the story that were still tender and that he had not said out loud to anyone, but he told her more than he had told most people, and when she was quiet for a moment after and then said, "It is hard to clean up someone else's mess when you loved them," he felt something in him that had been clenched for a long time very gradually begin to open. Cutter's Creek was a small town of perhaps 400 souls, strung along both sides of a main street that ran parallel to the creek it was named for. There was a general store, a livery, a hotel that doubled as a saloon, a barber shop, a blacksmith, a post office and dry goods combined, a church, and the law office of Horace Bell, which sat between the church and the general store with a carefully painted sign and a window that was always very clean. The town had been established in 1866 and had grown slowly and steadily in the years since, fed by the ranching economy that surrounded it and by the occasional influx of people moving west and needing a place to stop. Horace Bell was a small, precise man of 60, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and a manner that suggested he had spent his life trying to create order in an environment that was constitutionally opposed to it. He received Matilda and David in his office with careful courtesy, offered them chairs and water from a ceramic pitcher, and then spread the relevant documents on his desk and walked Matilda through them with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that the documents were the only reliable weapon available to her. The will was valid. Edmund Underwood had signed it in the presence of 2 witnesses, both of whom were alive and known to Bell, in May of 1877, more than a year before his death, at a time when anyone who had known him would have attested to his complete mental competence. The property deed was clear. The 40 acres were described precisely, with the survey lines marked, and the water rights were explicitly included in the inheritance, which was an uncommon specificity that suggested Edmund Underwood had known exactly what he was doing. "He came to me specifically about the water rights clause," Bell told them. "He said there were people interested in the property and that he wanted to make sure his heir had every possible protection." Matilda looked at the documents and then looked at David and then looked back at the lawyer. "He knew about Phipps. He knew about the consortium," Bell said carefully. "He called them the water men. He did not like them." "Did Phipps approach him?" A pause. "Several times over the past 2 years. Edmund refused each time, but the approaches were becoming more aggressive in the months before he died." Something passed across David's face that Matilda noticed but could not quite read. "How did Edmund die?" he asked. Bell removed his spectacles and cleaned them, which Matilda had already identified as his tell for information he found uncomfortable. "He fell from his horse. That is the official account." "And the unofficial account," David said. A long silence. "I have no evidence of anything irregular," Bell said carefully. "I only know that Edmund was an excellent horseman who had ridden the same trail for 30 years without incident." The room was very quiet for a moment. Matilda felt the weight of it settle around her. The full shape of the danger she had walked into, the dark past of this land and these people, and the stakes that had been in play long before she arrived. She looked at her hands in her lap and thought about the man who had been her great-uncle, who had never met her and yet had arranged for her to inherit his protection, and she felt a grief for him that was strange and specific, the grief for a connection that had existed without her knowledge and was now permanently severed. "I want to see the property," she said. David took her. They rode out of Cutter's Creek on the North Road and turned east along a cedar-lined track that wound up through the limestone hills until it crested a ridge and dropped down into a wide, shallow valley, where a spring-fed creek ran clear and cold through a grove of live oaks. The house sat back from the creek on a gentle rise, and it was smaller than Matilda had imagined but solid, built of the same pale limestone as everything else in the hill country, with a cedar-shingled roof and a covered porch facing east and 2 good-sized rooms and a separate cookhouse behind. The cedar and live oak around it were enormous and old and created a shade that made the whole property feel protected, enclosed, like a secret the land was keeping. Matilda stood in the doorway of the house for a long time without speaking. The interior was dusty from disuse but intact, the furniture still in place, a rocking chair by the cold fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the back room, a shelf of books that made her heart do a complicated thing. She crossed to the shelf and looked at the books. There were 12 of them, well read and carefully kept. A Bible, a volume of Shakespeare, 2 medical texts, several histories, and a collected edition of the poems of Alfred Lord Tennyson that was so thoroughly worn that the spine had been repaired with what appeared to be a strip of leather cut from the back of a work glove. She took the Tennyson down and opened it to the title page, and there, in a hand she did not know but recognized in some bone-deep way as familiar, was written, "To Edmund Underwood, who knows what it is to hold on. Your brother Josiah." Her grandfather's handwriting. She had never seen it before, had never known his name, but she knew it with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the particular knowledge that lives below reason. She stood there holding the book with both hands, and the feeling that moved through her was enormous and complicated and entirely unprecedented. And she did not try to contain it or manage it. She simply let it move through her like the current in the river, powerful and impersonal and in some way cleansing. David had stayed on the porch, she realized. He had given her this without being asked, the privacy of the moment, the space to feel it fully. She looked at him through the open door, and he was leaning against the porch rail with his back to her, looking out over the valley, his hat in his hands, and there was something about his silhouette against the October sky that she found she could not look away from. She went out onto the porch and stood beside him. Below them, the spring creek caught the afternoon light and the live oaks moved in a small breeze, and the valley was so quiet she could hear the creek running. "I am keeping it," she said. "I know," he said, and turned to look at her. And the way he looked at her in that moment was not careful or measured or restrained. It was direct and warm and entirely without pretense. And Matilda Underwood, who had been alone for 2 years and careful for longer than that, felt the box she had so carefully packed and sealed begin to come undone at the edges in a way she suspected was now irreversible. The practical reality of establishing herself on the property was considerable, and over the following days it was David who helped her navigate most of it. He rode with her to Belle's office to file the formal claim of inheritance and sign the documents that established her ownership unambiguously. He introduced her to the Cordero brothers, who assessed the property's physical needs with professional competence and drew up a list of repairs that was long but manageable. He brought lumber and tools from his own stores and worked alongside Pete and Sam for 3 days, clearing the overgrown brush from around the house and repairing the roof and rehinging the doors that had warped in the summer heat. Rosa came too on the second day, with cleaning supplies and seeds from her kitchen garden, and a wrapped bundle of dried herbs and spices that she pressed into Matilda's hands with a warmth that had nothing transactional in it. Rosa was a woman who gave generously and expected nothing in return, and asked everything of the people around her, in the sense that she expected them to be fully themselves. And Matilda found herself telling Rosa things she had not told anyone, about Louisiana and her parents, and the loneliness of the 2 years since, in the easy, honest way that Rosa seemed to create around herself. Matilda was beginning to feel, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, that she was somewhere she might stay. Gerald Phipps arrived in Cutter's Creek on the 7th day after Matilda's arrival. He came with 2 other men, and a lawyer from San Antonio named Clarence Foote, who wore a city suit and carried a briefcase, and had the particular expression of a man who had been hired to create problems. They took rooms at the hotel, and the next morning Foote presented himself at Horace Bell's office, with a document claiming that Edmund Underwood had been incompetent at the time of making his will, and that the property should revert to the state pending a full investigation. Bell sent word to Matilda immediately, and she was in his office within the hour, and David was with her because he had been repairing the cookhouse roof when Pete Cordero rode out with Bell's message, and he had come along without being asked, which Matilda did not comment on but noticed with a warmth that was becoming familiar. Foote laid out his argument with professional smoothness. Edmund Underwood, he claimed, had been observed behaving erratically in the months before his death. There were witnesses, he said. Men who had seen the old man confused and disoriented, who could testify that his mental condition was not what it should have been when he signed his will. Matilda listened to this with great care and then said, in a voice that was very level, "Who are these witnesses?" Foote named 3 men. David's jaw tightened at the names. "Those 3 men are all employees of Mr. Phipps's consortium," David said. Foote smiled the smooth smile of a man who had been expecting this objection. "They are independent citizens of this county. They have been on the consortium's payroll for 2 years, David said. "I can prove that." Foote's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did very slightly. "That would be a serious allegation." "It is a documented fact," David said. "And I have 2 of Edmund Underwood's neighbors who were with him regularly in the last year of his life, and who will testify to his complete competence. One of them is a physician." This, Matilda thought with a complicated admiration, was a man who had come prepared. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that he had been preparing for this possibility since before she arrived, possibly since Edmund died, and that the help he was giving her was not only practical but strategic, and that he had thought it through completely, and that this was, in its own particular way, one of the most intimate things anyone had ever done for her. The hearing before the county judge was set for 2 weeks hence, which Bell said was as fast as it could be arranged and fast enough to prevent the legal uncertainty from becoming too damaging. In the meantime, Matilda had 2 weeks to establish herself on the property, and make it as clear as possible to everyone in the county that she was not going anywhere. She worked those 2 weeks with a focused intensity that surprised even herself. She cleaned the house completely and rearranged what furniture there was to suit her and hung curtains she had sewn from a bolt of cotton she bought at the general store. She planted the winter kitchen garden with seeds Rosa gave her, following Rosa's instructions carefully and finding unexpected pleasure in the physical work of turning soil. She introduced herself to every neighbor she could reach, riding out with David on several occasions and on her own on others, and she found that the people of the Cutters Creek area were by and large decent, hard-working people who had no particular love for outside interests trying to control their water, and who received her with a warmth that was partly courtesy and partly the practical recognition that they needed her on their side. She met David's 2 witnesses, the physician named Dr. Samuel Kern and a rancher named Hector Delgado, who had been Edmund's closest neighbor and friend, and they were exactly what David had said, solid and credible and completely willing to say what they knew. Gerald Phipps called on her once. He came alone, which she thought was intended to seem conciliatory, and he sat in the rocking chair on her porch and turned his hat in his hands and spoke to her with the smooth, reasonable manner of a man who was certain he could talk his way into anything. He told her that his clients were prepared to offer a very generous price for the property, enough to set her up comfortably for years, and that the legal dispute he had initiated could be withdrawn immediately if she chose to accept. Matilda offered him a cup of coffee. He accepted it. She sat in the other chair and looked at him steadily and said, "Mr. Phipps, I appreciate the offer, but I am not selling. I am going to win the hearing. I am going to stay on this property. And I am going to be a very good neighbor to the ranchers who depend on this water. What I am not going to do is sell land and water rights to people who will use them to exploit the community that depends on them." Phipps's expression changed then, only very briefly, the smooth surface cracking just enough to let her see what was underneath it, which was a cold and calculating anger. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said. "Difficult for whom?" Matilda said. "Not for me. I find it quite straightforward." He left without finishing his coffee. She watched him ride back toward town, and felt the fear she had been keeping very carefully managed since she arrived rise up through the careful management and make itself known, and she sat with it for a while, honestly, without pretending it was not there. Then she got up and went back to her garden because the fear was real and the land was also real, and one of them she could do something about. David came that evening, as he had come most evenings since she arrived, initially with practical purposes to check the roof repair or bring a tool she needed, and then less practically, simply to sit on her porch in the early dark and talk. They talked about everything, about the law and the water rights and the coming hearing, about the ranch and what he was building there, and his plans for the next 10 years. About her plans, which were taking shape slowly and pleasingly, involving a kitchen garden and perhaps a small school, there being no school in the Cutters Creek area and Matilda's opinion of this situation being extremely firm. About books, always about books. He had read considerably more than she expected and differently than she would have predicted. History, primarily, and natural science. The kind of reading that a man who was trying to understand the world he lived in would do, and their conversations about what they had read had a quality she had almost forgotten existed. The particular joy of thinking alongside someone whose mind worked differently from yours, but with equal seriousness. On the 9th evening he brought her a book. It was a new one, bought from the general store, a volume of Mary Shelley's essays that had arrived with a recent shipment of goods, and he set it on the porch rail beside her coffee cup without ceremony, and she looked at it and then at him and said, "How did you know I had not read this one?" "You told me last week that you had read everything of hers you could find and had not been able to get your hands on the essays," he said. She had said that. She had said it in passing, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, and he had heard it and remembered it and acted on it, and the simplicity and completeness of this attention made her feel something that was no longer comfortable to hold at a distance. "David," she said. He looked at her. The lamp on the porch was throwing its warm light across the boards between them, and the hill country dark was thick and full of cricket sound and the smell of cedar. And she thought about all the careful ways she had been managing this, all the sensible reasons she had been cataloging for why this was not the moment and this was not the place, and she was not ready, and she did not know enough, and there were too many unresolved complications. And she thought that she had been doing this kind of management for 2 years, and she was tired of it, and none of the careful reasons were, if she examined them honestly, actually reasons. They were defenses. They were the habit of a woman who had learned to expect loss and had therefore arranged never to have anything she could lose. "I think," she said, slowly and precisely, as if she was working out the sentence as she spoke it, "that you are one of the most remarkable people I have ever encountered." He was very still for a moment. "Matilda," he said, and the way he said her name was not the way she had heard her name said before. It was not polite or formal or impersonal. It was the way a person said the name of something they had been thinking about for a long time. He reached across the porch rail and took her hand, and his hand was large and warm and calloused from work and entirely steady. And she laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that for a while without speaking, listening to the creek and the crickets and the night. And it was the most complete silence Matilda had ever been part of. The hearing came on a Thursday morning. The courtroom in the back of the county commissioner's building crowded with ranchers and their wives, and a scattering of townspeople who had understood, correctly, that what happened in that room would affect the entire region. Foote presented his case with professional competence and Bell countered it with methodical precision, and the witnesses were called in order, Phipps's 3 men first, and then David's 2, and the contrast between them was stark enough that Matilda saw it register on the judge's face. The judge was a man named Elias Hobson who had been on the bench in Cutter's Creek for 11 years and who had, David had told her, an excellent reputation for impartiality and a considerable dislike of outside interests attempting to manipulate local matters. He listened to everything with complete attention, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he ruled. The will was valid. The witnesses Foote had presented were of questionable credibility given their documented financial relationship with the consortium, a relationship David had indeed proven through records Bell had obtained. Edmund Underwood had been of sound mind and body when he made his will, and the property legally and fully belonged to Matilda Underwood. The room exhaled. Matilda heard it as a collective sound, the release of tension held for weeks, and then people were talking and the ranchers were nodding at each other with expressions of relieved solidarity, and Rosa Cordero, who had come in from the back of the room, was hugging her fiercely, and David was standing beside her with his hand on the small of her back, very lightly, and she turned to look at him, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do, something open and relieved and happy, and she thought, with the kind of clarity that comes after a very long period of uncertainty, that she was looking at the face of a man she was falling in love with, had perhaps been falling in love with, since he came wading into a flooded river to help her cross, and that this was, despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, exactly where she wanted to be. Gerald Phipps left Cutter's Creek that afternoon. He did not say goodbye to anyone, which did not surprise anyone who had been watching him closely, and Foote left with him, and the 2 men who had come with them, and the hotel went back to its normal quiet population of passing travelers and occasional cattle buyers, and the town of Cutter's Creek returned to its ordinary October business with a collective sense of something having been properly settled. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Matilda had experienced in as long as she could remember. The property was hers in the full, actual sense now, documented and defended and real, and she threw herself into the work of making it into the place she was beginning to see clearly in her mind. She expanded the kitchen garden into a proper winter planting, following Rose's guidance, and the soil in the Underwood Valley proved to be exactly as rich as the landscape suggested it should be. She cleaned and organized the house with the particular pleasure of a person who has never had a permanent space and is discovering for the first time what it feels like to arrange things according to your own preferences and know they will be where you left them tomorrow. She also began making inquiries about the school. The nearest schooling for children in the area was 7 miles east, in a one-room building that was attended irregularly and taught by a man who was, by several accounts, more interested in his own comfort than in the education of his students. Matilda wrote letters to the county school board and to a teachers' organization in Austin, and to 3 women she had known from her previous teaching work who might be able to advise her, and she began the process of understanding what would be required to establish a proper school in Cutter's Creek. David was at the property most days, ostensibly for various practical reasons: a fence that needed to be checked along their shared boundary, a question about water flow, a tool he had lent Pete Cordero that had ended up stored in Matilda's shed. But the practical reasons were becoming increasingly transparent as excuses, and Matilda found that she did not mind this in the least. He was good company in all the ways that mattered, useful and intelligent and honest, and possessed of a sense of humor that emerged slowly and was all the better for it. And the evenings on the porch had become the part of her day that she looked forward to most, which was a fact she had stopped trying to be sensible about somewhere around the end of October. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday evening in early November, on the porch with the lamp burning, and the night cold enough that she could see her breath. And it was not sudden or reckless, but deliberate and quiet in the way that everything he did was deliberate and quiet. And she kissed him back with the full intention of someone who has stopped pretending they don't want the thing they want. And when they separated, she looked at him in the lamplight with her heart doing extraordinary things and said, "I should tell you something." He waited. "I have not been doing this well," she said, "being somewhere, being in a place. I have been so afraid of losing things that I have been not quite allowing myself to have them." She paused. "I think I have been doing it with you too, except that I am finished doing it now." He looked at her for a long time and then said, "I have been doing the same thing since my father, since the business with the ranch." "I know," she said. "I could see it." "Could you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "From the beginning," she said, "from across the river." He laughed, which he did rarely and well, and then he took both her hands in his, and she felt, in the cool November air on the porch of the house that belonged to her, the particular and irreplaceable warmth of being known. The autumn passed and became winter, and the winter in the Texas Hill Country was cold but not brutal, with frost on the limestone mornings, and the creek running low and clear, and the live oaks keeping their leaves as live oaks did, evergreen and stubborn in the way of things that had found their place and decided to stay in it. Matilda's kitchen garden went dormant, and she covered it with cedar mulch Rosa showed her how to make, and she turned her attention indoors, to the house and the books, and the letters she was writing, and the plans she was building. She and David settled into something that had the texture of the right thing, easy and deep, full of the kind of daily comfort that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of someone you trust to face it with you. They argued sometimes about things that mattered, about the best approach to the school proposal, and about a fence line he thought needed moving and she disagreed about, and about a book she had loved and he had found overlong, and the arguing was clean and productive, and always resolved in either agreement or a respectful and specific disagreement that left both of them understanding each other better. She had not known that argument could be like this. She had known it only as a form of damage, and the discovery that it could be a form of closeness was one of the more surprising and valuable things the fall had given her. In December, he asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. They were sitting at her kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, and she was reading the letter she had received from the Austin Teachers Organization about the school, and he was mending a piece of harness. And it was entirely domestic and ordinary, and he set down the harness and said, without preamble, "I would like you to marry me." She lowered the letter and looked at him across the table, and he looked back at her with the direct, steady gaze that she had come to understand was his most honest face, the face he showed when he was not managing anything or calculating anything, but simply being exactly where he was. "Why?" she said, which was perhaps not what he expected, but was the question she most needed answered. He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated, because it meant he was not going to give her something rehearsed. "Because I want to spend the rest of my life having conversations like the ones we have. Because I want to argue with you about books and fence lines for the next 40 years. Because when I think about the future, I see this valley and I see you in it, and they are not separate things anymore." He paused. "And because I have been in that flooding river with you, and I know what it is to hold on to someone who is holding on to you, and I would like to keep doing that." Matilda set down the letter. The lamp flame moved in a small draft and settled again, and she looked at David Walker across the table in the kitchen of the house her great uncle had left her, the house that had brought her here, the house that had led her to the river, and the voice from the opposite bank and everything that followed, and she said, "Yes." The wedding was in January, small and proper, in the Cutters Creek Church with Rosa and Pete Cordero and Sam Cordero and Hector Delgado and Dr. Kern and about 30 of the neighbors Matilda had made in the autumn, the people who had come to the hearing, and whose children she was going to teach, and whose water she was going to protect, and whose community she had joined with both feet planted, completely, and without reservation. Horace Bell was there too, in his careful suit, and he shook her hand afterward with a warmth that suggested the formal exterior housed a considerably more feeling person than he usually let show. David wore his best suit, which was dark and fitted and made him look considerably more formal than she was accustomed to. And she wore a dress she and Rosa had made together from a fine cream-colored wool. Rosa had ordered specially from San Antonio. And when they stood at the front of the church, and the minister read the words and David took her hand and looked at her, she felt the full improbability and rightness of the journey that had brought her here. From Louisiana to San Antonio, to Mrs. Greer's boarding house, to a flooded river in October, to this church in this valley in January, to this. After the wedding, there was a gathering at the Walker Ranch, Rosa having organized it with her characteristic efficiency and generosity, and there was food enough for twice the number of people present, and someone produced a fiddle, and then someone else produced a second one, and the long front room of the ranch house became full of music, and the kind of easy, warm laughter that comes from people who know each other and are glad to be together. Matilda danced with David in the middle of the room, and he was a better dancer than she had somehow anticipated, steady and deliberate in the way of everything he did. And she thought with a happiness that was quiet and deep and entirely different from the sharp, tentative thing she had been careful with all autumn, that she was going to get to know this person for the rest of her life. They decided, after some discussion, to live at the Underwood property rather than the ranch house, primarily because Matilda felt strongly about maintaining the homestead's established character and the water rights independence, and also because the valley was, they both agreed, extraordinarily beautiful, and the house was, with some additions, exactly the right size for what they intended to build there. Pete and Sam helped them add a second room to the main house in February, and they put in a proper fireplace in the new room, and a larger kitchen with a proper cookstove that David ordered from the hardware catalog, and that arrived in March looking slightly miraculous and entirely overwhelming. The school was approved by the county board in March as well, after a winter's worth of letters and proposals, and one very effective meeting in Austin that David attended with Matilda, and that resulted in a commitment of county funds sufficient to build a proper one-room schoolhouse on a piece of ground just at the edge of town. They broke ground in April when the weather cleared, and the building was finished by the end of May, and Matilda was the teacher, which had not been explicitly specified in the county agreement, but which everyone who knew her had understood from the beginning was the intended outcome. She was a very good teacher. She had known she was a good teacher, and she was glad to have the confirmation of 23 children ranging in age from 5 to 14, who arrived at the schoolhouse door on the first morning of June looking variously excited, suspicious, terrified, and bored, and who by the end of the first week were arriving with a regularity and eagerness that told her what she needed to know. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography, and a history that was honest about both the grandeur and the injustices of the American story, which she believed children deserved to know fully, and she taught them to think, which was in her view the most important thing a school could do. She also taught them about the land, specifically about the aquifer and the water table, and the reason that certain practices of land use were better than others for the long-term health of the region. And the children who had rancher parents brought this information home, and the conversations that resulted were not always comfortable, but were, she believed, important. This was a community that would stand or fall on the health of its water and its soil and its people, and the school was going to be part of what kept it standing. David watched all of this with a pride that was uncomplicated and immense, and that he expressed not with effusiveness but with the steady, attending quality that was his particular form of love, the full presence that said, "I see you, I see what you are doing, and I think it matters." In the summer, Matilda realized she was pregnant. She told David at the kitchen table after supper, having spent the preceding week in a state of internal calculation that had moved through surprise and something briefly approaching panic, and then settled into a warm, steady joy that she trusted because it was uncomplicated, because it did not have the anxious quality of the things she had feared, and because joy, she had learned, felt different from its counterfeits. David was very still for a moment when she told him, and then something moved across his face that was too large for a single word, something that was made of wonder and fear and love, and the particular gravity of understanding that the world was about to become something new. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had taken it that first evening on the porch, and they sat for a while with the lamp between them and the summer dark outside the windows and the creek running in the valley below. "I am going to be a better father than my father was," he said quietly, and she heard in it not a performance but a decision made from a place of complete honesty about what he had inherited and what he intended to do differently, and she said, "I know," and she meant it completely. Their son was born in January, which made him a winter child like his parents' marriage, and they named him Edmund David Walker, for the gray tuncle who had made everything possible, and for the father who intended to deserve the honor of the name. He was a healthy and opinionated baby who arrived yelling with great conviction, and continued yelling for several months with a stamina that Matilda found both exhausting and secretly admiring, and who, once the yelling phase subsided, proved to have his father's steady dark eyes and his mother's gift for paying complete attention to things. Rosa was an extraordinary support during those first months, arriving most mornings with food and pragmatic advice, and the uncomplicated warmth of someone who loved the baby and his parents without qualification. And Pete and Sam Cordero took on additional responsibilities at both the ranch and the Underwood property without being asked, because the Walker-Cordero operation had become, over the past year and a half, something that resembled a family more than an employment arrangement. And they regarded it accordingly. The spring after Edmund was born, two things happened that completed the long process of settling what had been unsettled. The first was a letter from a law firm in Austin informing Matilda that Gerald Phipps's consortium had dissolved following an investigation by the state into their business practices, which had revealed a pattern of fraudulent acquisition efforts across several Texas counties that went considerably beyond what had happened in Cutter's Creek. Several of the consortium's principals were facing legal proceedings, and the entire enterprise was finished. The letter was formal and dry and entirely satisfying, and Matilda read it on the porch with Edmund in her arms and the spring morning going golden around her, and she felt, as she had not quite been able to feel until that moment, that the threat was truly over. The second thing was a conversation she had with David on the porch one evening in April, after Edmund was asleep and the night was warm and the cedar was budding, and the valley was full of the particular green of hill country spring, when he told her the last piece of the story about his father, the part he had not yet said out loud to anyone. He told her about the deal his father had made with the consortium in 1874, 2 years before his death, a deal that had exchanged certain grazing rights along the shared boundary with the Underwood property for a cash payment that had been used to save the ranch during a bad drought year. He told her that when he inherited the ranch, he had found the paperwork and understood immediately that his father had, without realizing it, given the consortium a document that could have been used to claim access to the Underwood water, if the consortium's ownership of the Underwood land itself had been secured. It was why he had been following the Underwood situation so closely. It was why he had been at the crossing that October afternoon when a woman in a dark blue dress came out of the rain and put one foot into a flooding river with her chin up and her eyes set. Matilda listened to all of this and was quiet for a moment and then said, "So you had a practical reason to help me all along?" "I had a practical reason to notice you," he said. "Everything after that was not practical in the least." She looked at him for a long moment and then laughed, which she did with her whole face in the way he loved, and said, "I think that is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." He said, "I hope not." And she laughed again and leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the April dark with the valley below them, and their son sleeping in the house behind them, and the spring hills going dark around the pale limestone ridges. And David Walker thought about a flooding river, and a rope thrown across brown water, and a woman who had met his eyes in the middle of a current that was trying to take them both down. And he thought that of all the things he had done in his life, this was the one he was most glad of, the stepping in, the not letting go. The school completed its first full year in June, and the ceremony they held at the end of it was attended by every family in the district, and involved speeches from the children, and a picnic on the schoolhouse lawn, and a presentation of a framed document to Matilda from the county board, acknowledging the extraordinary success of the Cutter's Creek School in its inaugural year. A document that she accepted with characteristic directness, and then went home and hung on the wall of the schoolhouse rather than the house because, she said, it belonged to the school and the students who had made it worth something. By the following autumn, the Underwood property had been fully transformed into what Matilda had been seeing in her mind. Since the first afternoon, she stood in the doorway of the limestone house and felt the valley settle around her. The kitchen garden was large and productive, and supplied not only their household, but contributed regularly to a collective arrangement with Rosa and 2 other women in the area, a kind of informal kitchen cooperative that had grown organically from the sharing of seeds and knowledge and too many tomatoes. The spring creek was clear and well managed, the water rights documented and protected, and providing the quiet security to the surrounding ranches that Edmund Underwood had intended when he left it to the granddaughter of his brother. Edmund David Walker was growing into a boy who walked early and talked continuously, and had strong opinions about horses and an endearing inability to pass a dog without stopping to make friends with it, and who appeared, at the age of 2.5, to have inherited the best qualities of both his parents in roughly equal measure, which was to say the stubbornness and the honesty and the capacity for deep, serious attention. In October of 1881, on a cool morning with the hills going gold and rust in the autumn light, Matilda stood at the edge of the Blanco River crossing and looked across the water at the spot where she had first heard David's voice. And she thought about who she had been on the afternoon she arrived here, soaking wet and frightened and determined to cross alone, because she had always crossed alone. Because she had taught herself that depending on anyone was the surest route to the particular kind of loss that she could not afford. She had been wrong. Not about the danger of depending on someone unworthy, which was a real danger, but about the possibility of someone worthy, someone who would cross a flooding river not out of obligation or design, but out of the simple human refusal to let someone face something alone who did not have to. She heard him behind her, his footsteps on the limestone bank, and she did not turn around immediately, just looked at the water, which was running low and clear today, autumn shallow, nothing like the brown torrent of 3 years ago. "Edmund is terrorizing Sam's dog again," David said, coming to stand beside her. "Sam's dog loves it," Matilda said. "Sam's dog has a problem," David said, and she could hear the smile in it. She turned to look at him, her husband, brown from the summer's work and steady as the limestone hills, watching her with that expression that was still, 3 years on, the most complete and uncomplicated thing she knew how to receive. She had learned over those 3 years to receive it fully, without the deflection of the first months, without the habit of looking for the catch. There was no catch. There was only a man who had made himself known completely and was satisfied with the same from her, and the particular life they had built together in this valley out of stubbornness and honesty and a flooding river and a decision not to cross alone. "I was thinking about the day I arrived here," she said. "October 13th, he said immediately. She raised an eyebrow. "I remember the date," he said without apology. She thought about what she had been and what she was and the distance between them, which was considerable, and had been crossed step by step in the way that the only real distances are crossed daily, with intention. She thought about her great-uncle's books on the shelf, the Tennyson with the repaired spine and the inscription in her grandfather's hand, and she thought that whatever strange and invisible thread of connection had run through all of them, Edmund and Josiah and her parents and herself, it had done what threads of connection were meant to do. It had led her somewhere. "I am glad I did not cross alone," she said. He took her hand, the way he always took her hand, with the same steady certainty he had brought to everything since the beginning, and he said, "So am I." They stood at the river's edge together in the October morning, the water running clear below them and the cedar hills going gold above. And little Edmund David Walker, who had followed his father out of the yard at a determined trot, arrived at the bank beside them, wedged himself between their legs, and looked at the river with the serious consideration of a child who is deciding whether to step in. "No," both his parents said simultaneously, and he looked up at them with an expression of serene confidence that suggested he found the restriction entirely unconvincing. Matilda laughed. David lifted the boy onto his shoulders, and Edmund gripped his father's hair with both hands and crowed with satisfaction, and they walked back up the limestone bank together, the 3 of them, toward the house in the valley and the morning's work and the life they had made, and the river ran on below them in the October light, clear and clean and no longer a thing to be crossed alone. There were more years after that, and they were good ones. The school grew until it needed a second teacher, and Matilda hired a young woman from Austin named Frances Webb who was serious and dedicated and became, in time, a close friend. The Walker Underwood property, as the neighbors had come to call the combined holdings in a kind of organic acknowledgement of the partnership that ran it, became one of the most productive and well-managed spreads in the county, not through dramatic expansion, but through the steady, attentive work of people who understood what they had and intended to keep it. Edmund grew up with the valley in his bones, the limestone and cedar and the spring creek, and the knowledge of the aquifer beneath everything. And he grew up with the books on his great-great-uncle's shelf, and his mother's belief that thinking clearly was the most valuable skill a person could cultivate. and he grew up watching his parents work and argue and laugh, and hold on to each other through the ordinary difficulties that life in the hill country in the 1880s involved, which were not small. Drought and market drops and a bad fever winter in 1884 that took 3 of the Cordero's chickens, and a great deal of everyone's peace of mind, but no one who could not be replaced. When Matilda was 28, she and David had a second child, a girl they named Rosa Elena Walker after the woman who had been the first to make Matilda feel at home in this part of the world. And Rosa Cordero cried when she heard the name and denied having done so for the rest of her life with a vehemence that fooled absolutely no one. Rosa Elena grew up fierce and curious, and with opinions that she aired continuously and without concern for audience or context, which her mother considered a character trait of great future promise, and her father considered entirely predictable given the parentage. They had a third child when Matilda was 31, another boy they named Josiah, for the great-grandfather who had written in the flyleaf of the Tennyson, and by doing so had, without knowing it, set a chain of events in motion that ended in this valley with these people. Josiah was a quiet, watchful child who loved books the way his mother loved them and horses the way his father did, and who grew up to combine these interests in ways that were entirely his own. The town of Cutter's Creek grew around them as the decade progressed, slowly and deliberately, the way things grew in the hill country, without the false acceleration of a boom town, but with the steady, compounding growth of a community that knew what it had and chose to keep it. The school was the center of much of this, as schools tended to be in communities that recognized their value, and the quality of the education Matilda had built there was spoken of in towns as far away as Austin, which was the kind of recognition she found genuinely meaningful, because it meant the children she was teaching were being taken seriously by the wider world. David expanded the ranch carefully over those years, adding acreage when it became available and made sense, and the cattle operation grew in the steady, unglamorous way of a business run by someone who was more interested in sustainability than in spectacle. He served a term as county commissioner in the late 1880s, largely because the county needed someone with the combination of practical knowledge and complete disinclination to be impressed by outside interests that David represented, and he was a good commissioner who finished his term and did not seek a second one because he preferred to be on his own land with his own people. He and Matilda grew into middle age together the way people grew into things they had chosen with full awareness, which was with a deepening rather than a diminishing, the understanding between them becoming more articulated over time, the love less urgent and more complete, the way a landscape becomes more known the longer you live in it, and the knowing does not reduce the beauty but increases it. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, January of 1888, they sat on the porch of the limestone house in the cool winter dark, the way they had sat on so many evenings, and the valley was quiet below them, and the cedar hills were black against the stars. And David had opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for a sufficient occasion, having determined that a decade of marriage was sufficient, and they drank it slowly and talked about the years, not sentimentally but specifically. The things that had happened and what they had made of them. Matilda looked at the stars over the cedar ridges and thought about the letter from Horace Bell that had arrived at Mrs. Greer's boarding house, and the borrowed mule, and the rain, and the river. She thought about how close she had come to crossing alone. She thought about the voice from the far bank, certain and clear over the sound of the current, and the rope that had arced across the brown water and landed at her feet, and the man who had come into the river himself rather than simply throwing the rope and waiting on the safe bank. She thought about all the people she had been before she arrived here, the girl in Louisiana with the teacher father and the unlucky mother, the young woman moving west with a trunk of clothes and no destination, the woman in the hill country of Texas in October 1878, standing in a flooding river with one foot in the current and her chin up, and the desperate, necessary stubbornness of someone who had run out of other options. She thought about what it was to have a home, not the concept of it but the specific physical reality, this valley, this house, this porch, this man beside her, the children sleeping inside, the spring creek below, the aquifer beneath everything, the land that had been held and defended and passed forward. She thought about Edmund Underwood in his rocking chair with his Tennyson, holding on, and about the inscription her grandfather had written in a hand she recognized across a distance she could not explain, and she thought that the line connecting all of them was not mysterious, but was simply the ordinary continuity of people choosing to stay in a place and make something real in it. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, in the easy way he asked it without pressure, the question that said, "I am curious about your mind in exactly this moment." "Everything," she said. "In order." He considered this. "That must be a very long list." "It is," she said, "but it ends well." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the January night was cold and clear above them, and the cedar hills were full of the winter quiet. And Matilda Underwood Walker, who had come to this valley alone and frightened and determined, who had planted her feet in the red Texas earth and refused to move and built a life that was hers in every possible sense of the word, sat on her porch in the dark with her husband and the wine and the stars, and she was happy. Completely and without reservation, the way she had not known a person could be until she had learned, on the edge of a flooding river, that crossing alone was not the only option available to her. It was not the only option. It had never been the only option. It had only taken the right voice from the right bank at exactly the right moment for her to understand that. And understanding it, she had stepped back from the water's edge and taken the rope and taken his arm and gone in, and the river had been cold and strong and frightening, and they had crossed it together, and on the other side there had been this. All of this, exactly this, which was more than enough. Which was, in every way that mattered, everything.